get in front of. And then on climate itself, and the industry and API believes it is a serious challenge that has to be addressed, and that part of you want to understand what we've been able to do here in the U.S. as far as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. That's been driven primarily by greater use of natural gas. Okay, now that's not the only answer. We will continue to see renewables increase as well. If you think about what's going to happen, overseas, that's when the real growth is going to be in China, India, and elsewhere. They too very heavily dependent on coal. What can we be doing to help them also be able to, substitute more natural gas? Again, they're going to find other sources as well. Not that nobody in the industry is denying. This is about how do we, what are the strategies we need to be able to continue to reduce our own footprint, and our products. What do our products do to help solve those problems as well? Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Ben. Thanks, everybody, for being here and for the invitation to come up here as well. I'm sorry to say I came up from Washington, so I was hoping to gloat a little bit, but I guess with the Celtics win last night, I won't be able to do that. So congratulations. Once again. I'm kind of tired of coming up here and congratulating sports teams in New England, but nonetheless, good for you guys. I'm sure it doesn't. We're hoping to experience it again one of these days. In Mary's introduction, she very, very kindly and diplomatically talked about how I guided the combination of ANGA back into API. That's a really nice way of saying that ANGA went away. And then when the price of oil went from $100 to $40, the members couldn't afford to have two different organizations, so I got to oversee the dissolution of a trade association. And if anyone ever tells you it's simple to do that, have them give me a call. We kept the lawyers busy. But turning to the topic today, which again I think is a fascinating topic, and I would also say that I read the pre-read materials and I thought they were very interesting. I hope everybody here did as well. I was telling Raul, to me it was like taking Dan Jurgens' books, The Prize and the Quest, and condensing them down to about 12 pages in a magazine. But it gave you a very good sense of where, how the last century of petroleum and its role in foreign policy. In fact, to that, I want to just give you a little bit of sense of API itself, what the American Petroleum Institute is, how it was founded, and how it's kind of played out throughout the last century. We, in 2 years, in 2019, we'll be celebrating our 100th year. We were actually created in 1919, obviously, do the math there, created by the federal government. And then we were created right after World War I to help ensure, we were chartered by the government to ensure that the country would have the resources, the fossil fuel resources it would need for defense purposes. So that was reason number one for API existing. The other reason to exist is we are a standards institute, is the American Petroleum Institute, and we are so we create all global standards for the industry. We're ANSI accredited, and it's a very serious part of what we do. I'd say about half of the staff at API are all done on the standard side. I think I'm correct in saying the very first standard that API developed was pipe thread. So California, a lot of at the time, a lot of production going on out there. Producers ran out of pipe, tried to go get pipe from a different manufacturer, and they wouldn't fit. So that was the start. Now we've got over 700 standards. They're cited in federal and state regulations hundreds of times, and we have offices around the world. While we do not get involved in policy overseas, we have offices around the world in Doha, and Beijing, and Singapore, now in Brazil, essentially spreading the standards piece of what API does. Obviously, it's a global industry. That's both for safety reasons, operational reasons, all the rest. The industry is very interested in having us play that role. But again, back to the topic at hand, I think it's to look at how the industry and how we all look, if you focus on foreign policy and the role that petroleum has played in foreign policy, I thought it was fascinating to look at it through the prism of the pre-read materials, because what I've been living more recently is what's the domestic focus? What's the prism from the domestic standpoint? And you even if you just start from the oil shocks of the early 70s and go through all that, fascinating how it played out in foreign policy. But for the general public in the United States, it played out, and I'm oversimplifying, through one filter, and that was price at the pump. And it's personally relevant. So whether or not the general public was thinking about the interplay of the Soviet Union at the time becoming the largest producer of oil, or of the Middle East playing a much bigger role, what OPEC had done, and all the rest, people were getting really ticked off when the price of gasoline goes up, and we've seen that cycle move quite a bit. But anyhow, part of what I wanted to focus on here today is this sense that as we're going through the energy revolution we've seen in the last 10 years, which I'll talk about as we go through the slides here, what that has meant for us as a nation, what it means geopolitically. But one of the things we're seeing more and more, and I think this is a bit of a misunderstanding, if you will. I think it's fair to say, without being critical of the general public, energy literacy in this country is not very high. I mean, very few people understand when you say, where does electricity come from? You still get a lot of out of that plug in the wall, or not understanding exactly what's producing the electricity, how much is it producing. Again, oversimplifying, but the general perception that we can tomorrow decide we don't want to use fossil fuels anymore and just start using wind and solar power. That's a really nice idea. It's just not possible, at least not today. And what this slide is showing you, and again, none of these are API numbers. This is EIA and the International Energy, or their International Energy Outlook. It simply shows out to 2040, this is a world that's still going to be very dependent on fossil fuels. Natural gas and coal will continue to play a role. Natural gas will grow, but oil, especially in the transportation sector, is going to continue to be a primary source of energy. You see nuclear continues to play a role. Renewables does grow, no question. Renewables is going to grow in the picture here. And I want to be also, I guess the one other thing I want to be clear about is, for an industry, we've got to have some humility. Nobody 10 years ago would have guessed, or would have told you that they knew how big a role natural gas was going to be playing today because of technological advances and other things we'll talk about. But here we are. And again, we'll get into some more of the details as we go along. I don't want to sit here and say we can't see some kind of additional technology advancement that allows for storage, that really jumps the technology ahead for solar, wind, and other renewables. But at least for right now, that's not something you can plan for. And when we know that energy needs are going to continue to grow, I think the estimate on this one is a 48% growth in energy, worldwide between now and 2040. You're not going to meet that by just building more windmills. You're going to need to have fossil fuels as part of that mix. So you think about, why is it that the United States was able to have this energy revolution over the last 10 years, and all of the benefits that's brought to us, both domestically and globally. You can sum it up. I can say there's the 4 R's of why the United States was able to play the role we have in this energy revolution. 4 R's: rocks, rigs, rights, and the rule of law. Okay. So the rock, obviously, that's the shale we're talking about, whether it's oil or natural gas. The United States is not alone in having those deposits. They're all over the world. China has huge reserves of shale that has the hydrocarbons in it as well. Europe has shale. South America has shale. I mean, we're not unique as far as having the geology. What we do have, at least for now, we have the rigs, meaning we've got the infrastructure in place. We've got the technology. We have the know-how. It's already here. This is just expanding to what we were already doing. Clearly, there's some gaps here we need on infrastructure, pipelines, and what have you, but the basic infrastructure was here. On rule of law, as much as the industry likes to complain about the regulatory processes here in the United States, compared to the rest of the world, you get more predictability and certainty here, given our laws and regulations. And then finally, and I think probably most importantly, the United States is, I believe, alone, if not almost alone, in having personal ownership of mineral rights. So if I want to, I want to produce the oil or natural gas on your property, I cut a deal with you. In the UK, the Crown owns the mineral rights, and in most countries, it's the government that owns the mineral rights, and that's who you're dealing with, as opposed to this market-based system, if you will. But that's what is then has allowed us. You've got the technology here. There's a system of incentives for innovation that allows companies to get out there. Interestingly, as we talked about ANGA, the America's Natural Gas Alliance, it was formed by the companies. These were all independent, so they were not the big international oil companies, not the integrated companies. These were the smaller, relatively, companies that were out there and actually took the risks on the technology. I'm oversimplifying again, but the big companies that essentially said onshore U.S., not exactly dried up, but not a great investment. So they were spending their time finding new places overseas and in the deep water, in the Gulf of Mexico and other places around the world. This gave a lot of space to the independents to figure out how to get this hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling to work, right? And they did. And in fact, when they finally figured it out, they decided they needed a trade association that focused on, we know we're going to be producing a lot of natural gas, but who's going to buy it? So our entire focus was on the demand side, power generation, manufacturing, exports, and transportation to a certain extent. Anyhow, what that has allowed us to do is, both from again, the same technology is used whether you're talking about natural gas or oil, by the way, the shale oil. And it's really put us in a position where we now can be a reliable partner to allies around the world, and we have helped to stabilize world energy markets because of the role that the United States has played. The simple fact that we're not importing as much as we were has stabilized oil prices around the world. So again, we'll come back to some of that as well. Again, getting the scarcity and abundance. I talked in the pre-read about all these different cycles over the years of supply and demand and prices going up and going down. So one of the questions is whether the new world we live in, are we going to see fewer of those cycles, or will they be less severe? I would say the answer is probably yes. And I'll go through a couple of slides here to try to demonstrate that. As U.S. oil production has continued to increase, we've clearly seen the price go down, and this is true on natural gas, which I'll get to in a moment. What this has allowed us to do by playing a much bigger role on the global market, especially on the oil side, since it is priced globally, as I said, it has helped to minimize and in some case eliminate some of the price shocks we've seen over the years. That was fascinating at the beginning of last year. Beginning of 2016. Every year at the beginning of the year we do a big State of American Energy speech, and we're out with the media quite a bit. It was fascinating at the time. There was real tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and even thoughts that they might start shooting at each other. I would venture to guess that had that happened a few years earlier, certainly 10 years earlier, you'd have seen a $10 bump in the price of a barrel of oil. It didn't move. In fact, it went down that week. And so it just goes to show that it has really changed the nature of the global marketplace for oil. And for natural gas, same thing. We've seen production continue to increase. The price has plummeted. Now, one of the things here to point out with natural gas, I think since 2005 we've seen production increase about 46%. The price has gone down 65%. I was talking with someone ahead of time about an investment they made earlier in this game, and probably should have waited a while. But nonetheless, what the other point to take away here is that, and I was talking about the not seeing the severe spikes anymore. Historically, you'd see these price drops in natural gas, and then when suddenly there was another big run up in demand, you'd see a delay in being able to meet that demand because you got to get out there and produce it. That would cause a spike in price. That almost doesn't happen anymore because we can turn the gas production back on so quickly. So we've brought the price down, and then even when there is more demand, we're ready to meet it, and it just, so the price will bump up a little bit, but we're not going to see these severe spikes like you saw. This big one here, I think that was a hurricane year back in 2008. The little spike there, 23 2015, that was the polar vortex. Okay, so you saw that winter did see a bit of an increase in natural gas, and since then it plummeted again, and we haven't seen, we're bumping at about 322 or something today, I think. So continued long-term price stability here from a natural gas standpoint. So now, again, just getting another sense of the abundance and what that abundance means. You may have heard even President Obama in one of his State of the Union speeches, and I guess let me take a step back too with President Obama, and I don't mean this as criticism of the president, but it was an interesting study, having come in 2008 at the beginning of this shale revolution, and then monitor his State of the Union addresses for a few years there, and see how his wording changes as he's talking about oil and natural gas. His first State of the Union address, we were yesterday's technology. There was a presidential proclamation that they do in the month of November on energy. He literally referred to oil and natural gas as a clear and present danger to the economy, to the environment. And then, lo and behold, 2011, 2012, as he's also coming up to re-election, there's 100 years worth of natural gas in the country. And we're seeing emissions reduce because we're using more natural gas instead of coal. Again, I didn't mean that as criticism of the president, but it was fascinating to be in the middle of it, trying to work with the White House at the time and see their wording change. What this shows you, and this was IHS, so Dan Yergin's group, about a year ago, essentially had a report that says we've got 1,400 TCF, trillion cubic feet of natural gas that can be economically produced here in the United States using today's technology, actually last year's technology, and it's economic to pull it out at a $4 cost. I told you it's about $3.20 today. 800 of that is economic at $3. The white box shows you how much we use in a year in the United States. That's just 27 TCF roughly in 2015 is what the United States used. So again, talk about the abundance. And this is what's economically recoverable using today's technology. We know there's a lot more out there, and we know the technology is changing very quickly. If you looked and saw the way they were doing the hydraulic fracturing and the processes that were used, 8 years ago versus today, they're totally different. So getting to that, if you look at the efficiency gains and the technology advancements that have come along both on the oil and natural gas on the fracking side. On the left here, this is oil production in the Bakken, which is North Dakota. And on the right, you've got gas production in the Marcellus region, so in Pennsylvania. What you see is production continues to go up while the rig count continues to plummet. Historically, we used to track production or get a good sense of where is production by tracking how many rigs are out there. Totally disconnected now, because every one of these rigs for natural gas, if I've been to several of these in Pennsylvania, might have 10 wells. They can have 20 wells on one pad, a little 3-acre pad, and you're not using the entire 3 acres, but that's what so you've got that pad and you got 20 different wells all going down to different depths, going in different directions. I visited a well site in northeast Pennsylvania, Cabot Oil and Gas. They were producing, had 10 wells running. They produce an equivalent amount of natural gas out of that well every day to meet the needs of the city of Philadelphia. So the scale of what's being produced is just enormous. And again, it's not about the rig count going down shows you the enormous efficiency and the technology advancements. Those are continuing. Using less, smaller footprint, lower emissions, capturing more of what you're going through in production and what have you. It's an incredible story from just a technology. I think it was in the pre-read materials as well, but this is a high-tech industry. As much as it's not perceived that way by the general public, it is a real high-tech industry. When you look at this, being able to turn a drill bit and go out for 2 miles through a seam of rock and know exactly what you're hitting because of your 3D seismic technology and all the rest. By the way, I'm way above my technical capability to explain any of that. I just know that's what they're using. So again, we've gone from being a major importer to being an exporter of energy. And let me just take a second to talk about the difference between energy independence and energy security. Everybody likes to talk about energy independence. I think President Nixon was probably the first one. We are not energy independent. We will continue to be both an importer and an exporter. And a lot of that has to do with, you think about the refineries that we have here in this country. Many of them they're built to process a very heavy crude oil. All of this new production is a light crude oil, light sweet as they call it. So you don't just now take the light stuff and send it to the refinery that just spent $3 billion to switch over to be able to process Canadian crude, for example. And we do have several in the country that have done that. So we'll continue to see imports and exports because that's what makes sense for the market. That's the distribution. Here on the East Coast, historically, they would import from Europe or Africa a light sweet crude. Well, now we have an opportunity to do more of that here. We prefer to talk about it as energy security, where you can talk about North America and we can be liquid energy independent in the coming years here. Again, we saw lifting of the ban on crude oil as of the beginning of last year. So in just 1 year's time, we're now exporting 1.1 million barrels a day. That clearly will increase, especially with prices where they are, and given our ability to get into that global market. What this shows you, the small blue lines, there were a small number of countries that we were able to export to previously. I think it was 10 of them. In 1 year's time, we've now got 26 countries that are receiving exported crude from the U.S. Where's that growth occurring? Again, this EIA's International Energy Outlook, non-OECD Asia, read China. So we've got big growth there, and then we'll see consumption continue to grow on in these various areas, but. Again, basic story is between now and 2040, we're going to continue to see energy demand grow and consumption in all these areas. Now, from a natural gas side, what this shows, think of this line here. Anything below the line is an import. Anything above the line is an export. And the pink, pipeline for is the pink on the bottom. That's Canadian imports. We're both importing and exporting to Canada because it makes sense. Depends on where they're producing, where is it needed. It's where the markets are. My guess is even here in New England, you might get some Canadian imports of natural gas, and certainly even some of the pipelines that are being developed. Some of it's being produced in Pennsylvania, will go up into Canada, and then come back around into New England. So we have a very well integrated energy market between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico as well. So that will continue. The big story here is, when you get past that line of 2016, growing pipeline exports to Mexico and to Canada, and then above that, that's our LNG exports going to countries all around the world. Last year, February of last year was the first shipment out of Louisiana, out of Sabine Pass. Cheniere is the company that has that facility. Dominion's Cove Point, I think, is slated to come online next year out of Maryland. And then there are at least 2 others that are approved, have all their permits ready to go. So we'll see a handful more of LNG export facilities built here in the U.S., which again gives us an enormous opportunity to get out into this global market. Natural gas is not priced globally like oil. So not to get too far into the weeds, because my understanding is too thin as well. But a couple of years ago, before we saw the huge drop in the oil prices, the idea that we are one of the low-cost producer as far as natural gas goes, and in Asia they were paying very high costs for their natural gas. Their natural gas costs are actually linked to petroleum. So when the petroleum costs dropped, so did the natural gas cost. So it's not as economic, but we're still seeing huge opportunities, and expected, as EIA says, we expect by 2022 to be exporting about 8 billion cubic feet a day from the United States. And again, because of that chart I showed you earlier on how much we have here in the U.S., we've got more than enough to meet all of our domestic needs and be a serious player in the global market. this just shows you from an electric power generation standpoint, the green bar is natural gas, and so and the blue bar on the bottom is coal. As we see, starting in 2006, we were about 20%. As of last year, 2016 was the first year that for the entire year, natural gas overtook coal as the largest fuel source for electricity production in the United States. That's not going to stop. Projections are that may go to about 40% in the coming years. And that brought lots of other benefits with it, of course, as well. So in power generation, we've seen emissions from electricity generation plummet, frankly. We've seen CO2 emissions from electric power sector are lower now than they've been in almost 30 years, down about 25% from where they were. And again, as natural gas consumed by the power sector has gone up significantly. Part of the message here is that we're once again showing that we're breaking this this perception, or what was a reality, that if we using more oil and natural gas means we're going to increase emissions, and that things are going to be worse for the environment. Again, I think because we're talking about here in the United States, for all the reasons we talked about before, we're going to force an innovation, and the fact that we're now using so much natural gas in the power sector and in manufacturing, not only seeing carbon emissions fall, methane emissions are falling as well. Again, even as we are, and by the way, natural gas is methane, so we have an incentive to capture as much of it as we can and sell that onto the market. But if you look across the entire system, what we've seen very clearly is that even as we've seen these significant increases in production of natural gas, the methane releases from our industry have gone down significantly as well. But again, it's carbon, it's methane, and it's just other air pollutants, your ozone, particulate matter. I don't think there's, most large cities in the country now are having far fewer days of being in what they call non-attainment. So your summer smog days where, code red and what have you, those numbers are all trending down in big cities around the country. And it's not solely due to natural gas, but it is greater use of natural gas is a huge factor in helping that along. And it's too busy a slide. The quick answer on this slide is that natural gas is also driving a manufacturing renaissance here in the United States, especially in the petrochemical space. From having worked with the chemical industry just before the energy revolution, I can tell you at the American Chemistry Council, our three top priority issues were natural gas, and natural gas. We were seeing prices at $12. We were telling you it's about $3 today. The industry, the chemical industry in the U.S. had become globally dominant because we had natural gas prices around $2, $2.50, and then suddenly it spikes up $9, $10, $12. Yeah, not so much. And there wasn't a single new chemical plant being built in the United States. Any world-class chemical plant was being built in China or in Asia or other places around the world. Today, it's just the opposite. The chemical industry itself has more than $150 billion of capital investments either underway or on the drawing boards because of the price of natural gas here in the U.S. You've got chemical companies in Germany, BASF among them, that they are relocating. They can't afford to continue operating as much as they are in Germany. They're relocating facilities here to the United States. It just, it's a no-brainer when the natural gas price, both for the energy and the natural gas liquids. So it's the natural gas also has liquids in it, ethane, butane, propane, and ethane then becomes ethylene, polyethylene, your plastics, all the rest. So the added value of what you're seeing from the oil and gas industry going through that value stream with all these manufacturers, that's what's creating this enormous opportunity, both from an economic and environmental standpoint, going forward. And then my final slide was just about what does this really mean for the consumer, and it has had a significant impact. And again, I think it was. AAA is the 550, and I think it was NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, had PricewaterhouseCoopers look at this, but the abundance and the affordability of natural gas has reduced household costs, for energy and electricity by an average of over $1,300, and the gasoline prices being so much lower now as well. Every driver's saving $550 a year. So again, I should have said at the beginning as well, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I think it was a fascinating topic to bring in here, and thought these are some of the kind of data points that would be helpful to have in the broader discussion on petroleum and foreign policy. So with that, happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
As I expected, we have like a million questions. So I'm going to, oh, you have water. Sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Russia has used natural gas and oil supplies to Europe as a lever on their foreign policy to the detriment of our objectives. My question to you is, with the projections of production in the United States, is there a time when we will be able to actually substitute our supplies for those coming from Russia?
The answer is yes, and it's already started. The Baltic countries, Lithuania has already built a facility. In fact, it's operating now for taking US LNG. They have received a shipment. Poland has a facility that just received its first shipment, I believe, 3-4 weeks ago. They are very anxious to have US LNG. Even before we started exporting, as I said, a year ago was the first one that left. So call it 2-3 years ago. Just the fact that they knew it was coming allowed countries in Eastern Europe to use that as leverage in their contracting with Russia. But again, Europe as a whole has undertaken a project to essentially reroute some of their pipelines to make sure they've got some redundancies and resilience, so they aren't as dependent on Russia, on this idea that cut it off coming through Ukraine, and now we're just we're starving the rest of Europe. But it was also fascinating because we worked in a coalition, API and ENGA at the time, with a group called LNG Allies, and it was made up of the embassies of about 9 different Eastern European countries in the U.S. They're a very credible messenger when they're going to the White House and the State Department of Congress saying, this is not just about selling more natural gas. This is a geopolitical, you're helping an ally here, and so we really want this. And I was talking with the Assistant Secretary of State, in fact, talking with her, but she also was making this presentation many times. Found it a little interesting that she'd go to Europe, where there had been more of a debate over whether they were going to allow hydraulic fracturing. So France isn't using it. Germany had said no to it, and other countries are talking about it. So she'd go in, so they'd be lecturing about fracking, and then when they get done, they'd say to the Assistant Secretary, "But you're going to send us your gas, right?" So anyway, long answer to your very good question.
Okay, so do Irv and Jared, and then we'll see how we do. Irv, Jared.
If you don't mind, take a few minutes to talk about the melting of the polar ice caps and the amount of energy that's now being made available. And just as a follow-up to 60 Minutes did a thing a week or two ago about Russia exploiting it, establishing their bases there. We didn't talk much about what we're doing, right? So if you could talk about that, I appreciate it.
Well, as you may know, there's very little U.S. development in the Arctic. I mean, we are in Prudhoe Bay in Alaska. Shell, of course, was in the Chukchi, I believe, Chukchi Sea, and their attempt a couple of years ago or maybe it was about a year ago, was unsuccessful. That's not to say there's nothing up there, but I know that's one company that spent over $7 billion over a 10-year period to be able to simply test to see whether something was there. Now, our senators from Alaska, the members to the Arctic Council, they're certainly very interested. As you said, Russia and other countries are actively exploring and developing, in the Arctic, and some of our companies have partnered with those countries to be able to do that. But we have not yet, the Chukchi, the Beaufort. Now, in fairness, some of that's market driven as well. We're producing an awful lot of oil right now. But if indeed we're looking at the longer term energy security and national security, if you will, as far as making sure we have a presence there, I think that it is a open for debate.
And we had Jared's question, and then I'm actually going to take the moderator's privilege. If there's anyone who has never been to a WorldBoston event before, I want to hear your question. So, Jared.
You mentioned that API has been around for nearly 100 years, and certainly as an institution that creates standards that are either driving regulation or been the recipient of regulation. Can you comment a bit on the current administration's aspiration to perhaps deregulate the industry, when in fact many of those regulations have been born of some of our nation's most terrible industrial incidents?
That's a great question, and I think that there's the perception of what. I'm not going to blame people for thinking that having the perception that yes, they just want to roll everything back. I will tell you from an API perspective, from our member companies' perspective, because we had our annual meeting about 5 days after the election, and just like the rest of the world, none of us had predicted what the result was going to be. On one hand, there was all right, now we're likely to have an opportunity here to kind of reset the table on how we go about doing regulation. Okay? And because, again, in our space, a lot of the regulation has been driven by standards from our industry, and again, recognizing that there's also been regulation driven by accidents and other things that have occurred over the decades. But the companies were very clear in saying this is not the time to dance in the end zone, spike the ball, whatever analogy you want to use. And we are certainly looking very closely at what are the regulations that we were already focused on. Regardless of who won, we were going to go to each of these agencies and say, gee, can we look again at this regulation and that regulation? And again, not to be unfair to the previous administration, I think I will tell you our experience had been that we would work very closely with EPA, with Department of Interior, and felt like we were getting most of the way down the field on some kind of cooperative program. Methane was a perfect example. I would have bet that we were going to have an agreement with EPA on expanding the existing regulation and launching a voluntary program from industry to get rid of certain types of equipment. The White House superseded and said, nope, we want a new Clean Air Act regulation, just crank it down even more. So there wasn't just in fairness, there was not a great sense from the industry that we had a very willing partner. We are hopeful that we can present the industry as no, that we're not against regulation. In fact, as I said, we've been driving regulation, and we think it has actually been good for the industry. But we do hope that we have, a more collaborative process going forward.
So, do we have any newcomers who have a question? Okay. Oh, there's a newcomer right there.
Marty, my name is Jason Mello. I develop medical devices. I don't know much about the petroleum sector, but I'm fascinated with learning new strategies, so thanks for being here and sharing your knowledge today. My question is in regards to strategy of the petroleum sector. If you look at top market cap companies as early as 7 years ago, they were dominated by oil majors. If you look at the top market cap companies today, they're dominated by tech companies. Alphabet, Microsoft, Facebook. Are there any best practices or any best strategies that the petroleum sector can adopt or is thinking of adopting, lessons learned?
I'm going to have to be honest with you. That's a hard one to answer. First, not my area of expertise, and I think this is a hyper-competitive industry. Okay. So the idea that you're going to have some kind of coordinated strategies, or all of a sudden, you may find some patterns of what people are doing. Not only are they very competitive, they're very careful. This is an industry that has had its issues with antitrust a long, long time ago, but they're hypersensitive to that. So it's hard to say, broadly for the industry, and certainly not something API would be focused on to say, here's what we think, here's the path of the strategy we think the industry ought to be taking. But all I would say is that having watched them go through this, energy revolution, watch the price go from $100 to $40, and everyone thinking, and by the way, let me take just a minute. Don't forget, I think part of what was going on there, getting to the topic at hand here, Saudi Arabia had decided at the time, they were not going to cut production to keep price up. They were far more focused on maintaining market share, and their market share, now that we weren't importing so much, was China, and now other producers around the world were starting to undercut them there. They weren't going to be undercut, and they wanted to see how far could they go in trying to push U.S. shale producers out. And I'm not trying to assign specific motives, but I think that is part of what was going on there. And in fairness, I think there were a lot of people that thought, boy, you get under $60, this is going to be really tough. Well, it went to 50, it went to 40. And I can tell you today, there are companies that would tell you they've got a lot of this is well by well or play by play. 30, they can do that. 20, they can probably do that too. Now, you'll see production drop if the price goes that low. But it's a fascinating industry as far as the innovation and how cost will drive that.
Thanks.
So.
Okay, so we had Bruce, and I'm just wondering if there's any women who have any questions. Anyway, so we'll do Bruce.
Gender diversity.
Thank you for your presentation. Very inspiring. It seems to me that the prospect of natural gas, is very brilliant. But it also seems to me the production is abundant and maybe too much. So that would influence the price. I wonder if the companies in America can negotiate the price. I heard that.
Okay, this is where the lawyers throw a flag on the table and say you got to stop talking. Yeah, because
OPEC countries, they can do that.
They can, but they're a cartel. No, not at all. You can't even think about it.
Okay. Another question is actually the same question. If we cannot control the price, then it might not be a good object to invest. Do you agree or not?
I'm not giving investment advice. I will just tell you that just like any commodity out there, and chemical industry was certainly one of those, and now that we are talking more, you can think of oil and gas in more of a commoditization because it is almost a manufacturing process now. There aren't too many dry holes anymore. We know what's there and how you're going to get it out. So because there's no opportunity for collusion, cooperation, what have you. Sometimes you got multiple companies going after the same demand. That means you overproduce, price goes down. I mean, these are normal commodity cycles. So don't be surprised if we see some of that. But for those other reasons I mentioned before, it's been pretty flat.
All right, up. Ask, you shall receive. Jane over here.
Thank you very much. I know absolutely nothing about the handicap, whatever that is, financial sort of thing that API is involved in. I know that when I go to the gas station, how much my gas costs, and when I travel in Europe, how much more it is and how much more it is in Australia. But when I was listening to you, Bill, I really enjoyed your presentation today. But I think part of the way that I was looking at this to ask a question that was referred to a little bit earlier, polar ice cap is decreasing. Towns like Azzi and Reno, Texas have an increased earthquake kind of situation. Can you tell me what API's concerns are? The rules and regulations that you want to, are those involved?
Absolutely. Well, take the two of them. the seismology, the earthquakes, absolutely a concern for the industry. Working very closely with the state of Oklahoma and Stanford University and others. I mean, by the way, it's not that. I'm not making excuses. It's not the actual hydraulic fracturing and the production of gas. It's putting the water down in these injection facilities that is required by EPA. Again, not criticizing EPA on that either. But yeah, those are absolutely issues that as they come along, you have to figure, well, all right, that was an unintended consequence. So what do we need to do? So you've got in this case, the state government has taken a stronger role to shut down or lower the pressure that you can use in those injection wells and what have you. So again, that too is an area from a standard standpoint, and also just collaboration and best practices with the industry that they want to get in front of. And then on climate itself, and the industry and API believes it is a serious challenge that has to be addressed, and that part of you want to understand what we've been able to do here in the U.S. as far as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. That's been driven primarily by greater use of natural gas. Okay, now that's not the only answer. We will continue to see renewables increase as well. But if you think about what's going to happen, overseas, that's when the real growth is going to be in China, India, and elsewhere. They too very heavily dependent on coal. What can we be doing to help them also be able to substitute more natural gas? Again, they're going to find other sources as well. It's not that nobody in the industry is denying. This is about how do we what are the strategies we need to be able to continue to reduce our own footprint, and our products. What do our products do to help solve those problems as well?
Okay, so we'll do two more. I guess I'm starting a little late. So Jeff, and then anybody else? Okay, Jeff.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. Just a question. In recent weeks, we've seen some emphasis in the coal industry, particularly with the current administration. My question is the demand for coal and in the coal industry in general, how much of that has been influenced by regulation versus natural gas prices?
Sure. Well, I'm not going to deny that regulations have played some role. The mercury and air toxics rule certainly influenced a lot of utilities in their decisions to decide not to use coal anymore, or whether they were going to put scrubbers and what have you. But it's also just as fair to say that I think that the larger factor here has been the rise of natural gas and the abundance and the affordability of natural gas that just makes it, it's a no-brainer. If you're now going to move in, you need, when you're talking about electric utilities, there's certain attributes you have to have, and you got to be dispatchable. That's the word I was looking for. It used to be talking about you need base load. There's no question. Coal and nuclear have long been base load power. They're just on all the time. Natural gas can do that as well, but the nice thing, natural gas can also turn on and off very quickly, in a matter of hours, as opposed to a day and a half or however long it might take, for a coal facility to do that. It provides great amounts of flexibility, to the grid operators. And as I said, now that we've got, your natural gas is in general a little less than half of the carbon emissions from coal. So you're seeing huge benefit on the emission side. But you want to be dispatchable, you want to be able to follow load, you want to be able to ramp up and down very quickly. These are all benefits that natural gas bring to the equation as we now have to meet a growing need for power, or as we're seeing. Let me be clear, in electricity markets, there's a fairly flat market now. We're not expecting great growth, and a lot of that has to do with efficiency improvements. But as you're starting to see, whether it's coal plants or nuclear plants retire, natural gas is in a position to replace that.
Great. Okay, so one quick
had, Raul.
question, and then we are going to have networking and conversation. So a quick question from.
Yeah, just a quick question.
Sure.
On pipeline capacity.
Mm-hmm.
More gas, pipeline is one of the major means of getting it distributed, and you're seeing more opposition, I think. I know in my community there's opposition to pipeline expansion. So give us your thoughts on the big picture on adding additional pipeline.
Yeah. No, great question. I think it's another one of these where it's breaking through the what I would call the false debate over whether you can we can increase fossil fuel use or not. I mean, New England's it's the poster child. There's more pipeline constraints coming into New England than any other region in the country. Your electricity prices in New England are 50% higher than the rest of the country. You're just 150, 200 miles from the most prolific natural gas field in the world right now. Yeah, we can't get a pipeline built, new pipelines built. 50% of your electricity in New England is now being generated by natural gas, and that's going to increase. I think part of what has happened is that, well, not I think, I mean, this has also gotten, conflated with, the broader debate on climate. If you'll follow me for a moment, we had, the environmental community back in 2009, 2010, certainly felt confident that they were going to get legislation passed in the Congress, cap and trade. It didn't happen, and I was there at the time. I did not predict that it was going to pass. There were just too many problems with the particular proposal. But just setting all that aside, the environmental community, it took them a while to say, now what? Where do we go? Because then they tried going to states, and even at the state level, it was hard to get comprehensive programs. What they figured out, to their credit, and I give them credit for this, is that the Keystone XL pipeline, they could stop one permit. And they only needed to convince one person, the president. He alone had authority to say whether that pipeline was built. So they created, up to then there was a small group called Forest Ethics that was trying to get people to boycott oil sands, crude and what have you. Suddenly, Bill McKibben and everybody else in the world came into this. So long story short, they won on that, at the time, but they also developed a playbook. And now that same playbook is used. Local pipelines, a compressor station that just has needs some more power to it, and again, this so I'm part of this criticizing the industry itself. We have to do a better job. We are out there much more explaining what the benefits of this pipeline will mean. We need to make it, frankly, so that elected officials at all levels have the, whether you want to call it political courage or the comfort level to say, no, I hear you. I'm going to make sure the pipeline is built safely and built right, but here's why we need it. It's going to lower prices. It's going to help the environment. It's going to help the economy, and what have you. We don't have that right now, and we're in the midst of trying to figure out how do we create that environment? Because when you bring it down to the local level, we're finding not so much here, but if you go to other parts of the country, suddenly the environmental community and the Tea Party are coming together on issues like eminent domain, property rights. What do you mean this company's going to come in and tell me what, they're going to take my property to build this pipeline? So some interesting bedfellows that have come together on this issue. But there's no question, especially in an area like New England, you're going to need more pipeline capacity in the future here.
Okay, so with that look into the future, I just want to make two quick points. One, Marty kindly mentioned the pre-read material. As many of you know, Great Decisions is the thought child, the product of the Foreign Policy Association, and we do have their briefing books, which are spectacular. I think they're very well done. And you can ask us, and we sell them at a deep discount. And the other thing I want to say is how grateful we are to Marty for being here, not only for the presentation, but we feel that this is a voice that we don't always get to hear in Boston. And that's what WorldBoston is about. So thank you very much, Marty, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.